welcome from the UK. My name is Paul Mills. I'm chairman of Relational Peace Building Initiatives. I'm going to introduce soon Jeremy Ive, who's going to speak to us for perhaps 30 minutes. Then we'll open the session up to questions that I'm also going to participate in, as if they stray into economics and finance, that's what I'm covering. Jeremy is more the peace building and negotiations. So when it comes to specialist questions on economics, I'm meant to be covering that. My background is in finance and economics. I've worked at the UK Treasury and at the IMF, and particularly interested in applying the view of the Bible to economics as well. So that's fed into some of the thinking that Jeremy and Michael Schluter in the past have done in terms of applying the relational model to peace building, both in Korea and Ukraine, Russia. If you have questions, that'd be particularly helpful if you put them in the chat, and then I'll sort of collect them together, and either I'll answer them or direct them to Jeremy. So with no further ado, if Jeremy would like to first introduce himself and then show the slide presentation, and then we'll do Q&A after that. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Jeremy Ive. I've worked with what was now Relational Peace Building Initiatives. Now I'm currently the senior advisor, but I was involved with Michael Schluter in peace building in South Africa, Sudan, Rwanda, and then we are working also at the moment in parallel on Ukraine and Korea, the Korean Peninsula. My focus, my background and involvement is much more on the political and peace building side, as Paul mentioned, and so I hope he'll chip in when it comes to the economics. Michael Schluter can't be with us today. He's got a lot of issues at home, and he's got to sort those out, I'm afraid, so he can't join us at the moment. But we are drawing heavily on his ideas and what he was thinking about. Not least in terms of the book. You can't see me because it's all on the screen, isn't it? But it's the book, No Other Way to Peace in Korea. So I'll jump in quite straight away. First of all, as we've been dealing with this, and this is following from our previous session, which you can see online if you go to our website. We're looking at the whole situation regarding the Korean Peninsula, but also in a parallel way with the situation in Ukraine, because we're suggesting that there are important things to learn between the two situations, and indeed the two situations are very closely interlinked. The question is, what hope is there for the future of the Korean Peninsula, given its divisions, and also the Russia-Ukraine situation? How do we build peace? We need a roadmap. We need to trace out how we can get there. But we also then need to build the trust on the basis of that roadmap, with the idea of coming to a peaceful outcome in both the context of the Korean Peninsula as well as in Ukraine. So what we've come to is the idea of a mutual convergent development process, MCD, which is a way to build peace in both situations. How this fits into the wider picture, you see we have different phases suggested. We last time dealt with the whole issue of phase one in the case of Korea, the Korea Peninsula Agricultural Community. In the case of Ukraine, looking at the lower Dnieper as the focus for cooperation with water, energy, and environment. water being the Kakhovka Dam, which will be destroyed, energies, focusing especially on the Zaporizhzhia power station, nuclear power station currently not in use, and the environment, which is under huge pressure from both sides of the divide. If you know the situation, the Ukrainians hold right bank, if you go downstream, and the Russians hold the left bank. And so there's this vision in war at the moment going on. What we're looking at today is a common business, trade, and finance area for both contexts. In the case of Korea, the Korean Peninsula, we talked about the KPEC, the expansion of KPAC, the agricultural community, into an economic community. So let's look at, so there we go, the economic community, KPEC, and the Ukraine area economic community across those divides. Of course, I don't need to tell everybody, but this is just rehearsing the division of the Korean Peninsula from the occupation by the Russian Soviet Union in the north and the Allies in the south, and then with the two separate polities being set up in 1948, and then the war, and that resulting in the armistice of 1953, which is the current division. And then, of course, we've got in Ukraine, we've got a similar divide in a way because we have the Russian occupied areas, which you can see in pink, and the Ukrainian area, which is mostly in yellow, but also the blue, which they won back from the Russians. So we're suggesting that if there's an armistice for Ukraine, as there has been for Korea, we would have essentially a frozen conflict based on the lines of contact in the areas of control. But a frozen conflict is better than a warm fighting conflict in which people are dying and huge damage is being done. But we need to go on from there. That can't be the end of the story. That has to be the basis on which we can then work for peace in the future. So moving on, in relational thinking, and especially the relational thinking developed by Michael Schluter, there's this notion of relational proximity, a way to build trust. How do you build trust? So within relational proximity, we have three necessary foundations for building trust. The first is that there be mutual knowledge. Second, that there be mutual respect, and that their values and goals alignment. Now, in knowledge, we have the why and the how of mutual knowledge, which drives empathy, which is built through face-to-face meetings and needs appropriate balance of privacy, transparency, and accountability. So that's knowledge, mutual knowledge. And then we come to mutual respect, so that as people meet together, they build mutual perceptions of fairness, they get to know one another, and they get a sense of where each other is, and that enables participation and encourages recognition of the rights and responsibilities on both sides of that divide. And then thirdly, we have values and goals alignment to build, which is vital if we're going to build non-coercive cooperation. In other words, no complex society can exist without non-coercive cooperation. In other words, not forcing people to do things all the time, but getting them to cooperate and then build things together to work peacefully and effectively together. And in order to grow, you can't have any society growing and faring well unless you have a basis of values and goals in that society. Now, we have liberal capitalism now almost as the default with the failure of socialism in many countries, including the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and indeed in China too, the People's Republic of China, that has moved away essentially from what was socialism. You've got a few remnants, indeed. North Korea attempts to continue on a socialist basis, although there are very strong capitalistic elements involved with private finance in that country as well, in the hands of Donju, etc. So you have a liberal capitalism as the default arrangement. But this situation is not really acceptable because all the countries in the world which have been dominated this are suffering with population challenges. Certainly in Europe, America, and in Asia. The Africa is still hugely growing with population growth, but that's not sustainable in the longer term. But you have breakdown of families, you have personal and national debt growing, and you have personal suffering in each of those situations as a result of the system. In response to this, we developed a relational peace building or relational research or relational relationships foundation, the whole family of organizations which Michael Schuster has been setting up, suggests then there's some principles which need to be taken on board if things are going to work. First of all, you need to have parity, that there's mutual recognition, there's directness, there's a good quality of communication, there's continuity which is unfolded over time. You need to get to know one another and learn to trust one another. There needs to be multiplexity, that people's engagement with each other shouldn't just be in one way, but there could be many ways of which they can interact, and that there's a commonality, that there are shared goals which direct the way things should go. And the benefits of this, we suggest, are that there is political stability, that over time, societies can continue without continual disruption and uprising and huge dissatisfaction, as is the case in many states at the moment, many countries at the moment. That there's good economic performance, good business performance, and that there is a high degree of personal well-being. So looking at those one by one, political stability, we suggest that that's built through healthy relationships. As people build good relationships with one another, that there can be social cohesion in different societies, that there's ways to resolve conflict because they can then listen to each other and talk, that there can be civic engagement. In other words, people aren't just intent on profit, but are able to build societies in a wider way. So that's the first thing. The second is sound economic performance based on trust, that there are lower transaction costs. If you have to bring lawyers in to make sure that everything is absolutely, every T is crossed and every I dotted, it can be extremely expensive. You need to build ways of trusting one another. You need to allow people to collaborate with one another. You need to encourage innovation and collaboration. You need to provide for long-term investment in society, because people then have a stake in what is happening and what the outcomes are. And that there is ethical conduct. In other words, that issues such as, of course, different forms of corruption, of nepotism, of unethical behavior can be counteracted. That's the second, sound economic performance based on trust. And the third is personal well-being as a goal. In other words, not a means, so that personal well-being is not just a way to get more money, but it's something which the whole society should be promoting and making a priority, and that people should be looked at as a whole, and that there should be an ethical framework for society. When we come to society, we look at the different kinds of capital that there are. There's firstly financial capital. That's how much money we have in our banks. But that's just only one. If we just think about financial capital, we've missed it. We need to have human capital, for example, how many people can be employed, intellectual capital, what the new ideas are, natural capital, in other words, using of resources, but be making sure that those resources aren't depleted. Manufactured capital, in other words, what has been produced and the new ways of doing things. But we say that what binds all of these together is relational capital. Relational capital, unless you have these good relationships, all these other forms of capital aren't really promoted in the right way. They don't have their proper place. One can be overemphasized at the expense of others, and in the long term, it causes damage to all. So we need to focus on what the relational capital is. And in thinking about relational capital, we need to think about the categories of stakeholders that there are. There are different sorts of stakeholders. There's, first of all, there's direct stakeholders, for example, directors, shareholders. We need to think of those who have direct stake in what happens in any enterprise. Mediating stakeholders, trades unions, regulators, business associations who are making sure that things are done properly. Indirect stakeholders, families and communities affected by, for example, the families of those who are employed, etc. So these are the different forms of categories that there are, but we need to think in any outcome of all these stakeholders, not just the bottom line, simply the financial outcome. So in doing so, we need to think about the relational economy, that we need to include relational business objectives in the M&M and AA. Now, that's the memorandum of association, which and articles. Sorry, the memorandum and articles of association, which any business needs to have. In other words, it needs to be built into their very constitution, and there shouldn't be an add-on. And that also there should be a perceived fairness in all the different arrangements, and that there should be ways of linking up. Sorry, the promotion of so there should be promotion of dialogue within the organization, and that there should be direct and transparent ownership in that organization by all concerned, and that managers should respect employee interests in what they do, and that the income between the very high level employers and the very low, the sort of ones regarded as low but all involved in business, should not be too great. So sorry, I've moved on. So I've jumped ahead a bit there. So then we have the finance principles. In other words, in financing in the organization, there needs to be aligned goals. There needs to be fairness and transparency and personal connectivity. In other words, that in financing an organization, it needs to be not just a matter of the bottom line, but also making sure that the goals involved are aligned. Secondly, that this be a fair and transparent arrangement, none under the counter arrangements, and that their personal connectivity, in other words, it's built on good personal relationships. So that's the finance principles. Now we come to Korea and Peninsula. Now we've already built on what I was saying was the Korea Peninsula agriculture community, and now we come to what we call APEC, the Korea Peninsula Economic Community. So that, in other words, from the exchange of agricultural goods, which we were suggesting in phase one, we build on that cooperation to widen it out to a wider arrangement across the peninsula, building on what is in common. And there should be a council of ministers, we suggest, to help to facilitate this between the two polities. We need to have a shift in this from a focus on GDP growth to a much more relational approach. Now, of course, both North Korea and South Korea are coming from very different economic models. What we're suggesting is the relational approach bridges those two, because it builds on the relationships which need to be part of a good economic system. And that also involves avoiding anonymity in the transactions. In other words, that capital should not be divorced from those who are investing, that they should be involved in the process. It should be there to strengthen family bonds and shared goals, and there should be a move away from monopolies. And then when it comes to business, similarly, we come to the business model that we include. So we shift then to greater stakeholder participation in the whole society, in the whole arrangements. We build on those who are involved and involve them in the decision-making process. We promote industry clusters. So, for example, where things are done well, they can be focused on as ways to create centers of excellence, so that these can really be ways to participate in world economy. And then the synergy through complementarity of the two systems and resource bases, because North Korea and South Korea are coming at from very different bases. And there we can use the very diversity, with North Korea having more natural resources in their area, South Korea being much more developed in terms of its economic and industrial performance. So these two can help to build each other up in a way that's going to promote the good of the whole peninsula. And in doing this, promoting equity over debt, in other words, making sure that finance is not based on debt, but rather on stakeholder involvement in different enterprises. And so similarly, avoiding debt finance, in other words, looking at ways to involve people in sharing of profits rather than of simply payments of interest. And similarly, restricting government borrowing so that the whole country, so that the government does not suck up all the capital, and that there's enough to go around in the whole society to promote good economic performance. And then enabling and rewarding direct and local investment, trying to decentralize, devolve economic power. So it's not all concentrated in one place, as is happening, especially, of course, in South Korea. And then building intergenerational justice so that the future of those who are yet to be born, indeed, is secured, not undermined through profits. So when we come to Ukraine, similarly, that there be a common business and financial area across the divide. So this is building on the arrangement that we would envisage in phase one with the lower NEPO water, energy, and environment community. So this would be a new form of cooperation, ensuring that good relational principles are in place across the whole area. Now, there are lots of different pulls on the Ukrainian area, of course. Firstly, from EU membership, there's a desire amongst the government in Kiev to join the EU. And there are outcomes which need to be taken into account there. Of course, it'll help very much in their anti-corruption efforts, because the EU has very high standards about that. But at the same time, they'll be putting pressure on labor markets, and that would be something to be careful about. Secondly, from America, Mr. Trump made a deal with the Ukrainians for a profit-sharing arrangement in the exploitation of rare earths and energy resources. Now, that has upsides and downsides, but again, it needs to be very carefully looked at so that this does not become an exploitative arrangement. And then thirdly, there are the Russian-occupied areas. And of course, Russia is heavily dominated by large organizations, Gazprom, Naftogaz, etc., especially focused on the energy industries. Now, how this can be facilitated is something which will need to be carefully worked through, and that it shouldn't be totally dominated by energy and also by these large corporations, and that again is to be to encourage local dynamics, local enterprises should be explored. Then there are the effects of the war, which have been horrific, of course, but there have also been the interesting effects of building relationships, because in the war, people have been forced to fall back on their own resources. And so this can have a strangely beneficial effect in the long term. Not that war is anyways beneficial, but the outcome of it can help to build a relational economy. So if we think about a relational economy for Ukraine, we need to be finding ways to balance exports and imports. In other words, that it should not become a debtor economy, that the balance of trade should be well looked after, that key industries should be safeguarded and not simply handed over to other very powerful groups, be it in Western Europe, in US, or Russia. That SMEs, small and medium enterprises, should be nurtured, they should be given space, and that there should be decentralization in the economic system. Then we come to a relational finance model. There should be support for SMEs, that there should be ways to fund SMEs in the more local way. There should be much greater decentralization of the economy, that the economy should not be focused upon, for example, in Kiev or one or two central areas, but it should be distributed much more amongst the different oblasts and local areas. Ethical reconstruction, now, of course, the whole issue of corruption has become quite a major one in Ukraine. Last week, of course, there was a whole controversy over the two bodies which were temporarily done away with, but now I understand they'll be restored. And that's very important, that it be done with a good eye on holding in check the danger of corruption, and that there be international partnerships. That these international partnerships, well, the Trump deal in a way is an international partnership, but these should be put much more on an equal footing. And then taking the agenda forward, that we need to think about ways to build peace. And this is where the economic community needs to be part of the wider agenda, just as it builds on the notion in the case of Korea, with the agriculture community, in the case of Ukraine, with the community across the whole Ukraine area. So we need to move then beyond the economy to social exchanges. So we need to move towards decentralization and fostering cultural commonalities across the whole area, so that there's a sense of unity and common understanding, which can foster the sort of economy and the sort of society which we need to try and build, which needs to be built. And this is true for both the Korean Peninsula as it is for the Ukraine situation. Both of them, of course, caught up in the current geopolitics, but we're envisaging ways forward as we look towards the middle distance, where these other possibilities can start to come into. Finally, there's a rigging list here, starting at the bottom. Well, the last book is really the one I referred to first, which is No Other Way to Peace in Korea, Practical Path to Reunification, which really RPI brought out in 2022. And this is really sets it out in much greater detail how this would work out in the case of the Korean Peninsula. But it also provides a very good model, which I suggest can be worked through in the Ukrainian context, and we should be working on as well for building an economy, but also the whole process of what we call the mutual convergence development process as a way to peace in both the Korean Peninsula and in Ukraine. Thank you very much.